They pointed at her to humiliate him. He looked across the room, nodded, and walked straight toward her. The laughter stopped before he even reached her. Eleanor Vance had long ago made peace with her own invisibility. It was a cloak she wore, woven from threads of plainness and an unfortunate lack of dowry. At balls like this, hosted by the ever-gregarious Lady Danbury, she was part of the architecture, no more noticeable than the potted ferns or the damask wallpaper. Her heart did not flutter with anticipation. It beat a slow, steady rhythm of resignation. She watched the other young ladies, vibrant as hummingbirds in their silks and jewels, their laughter like the chiming of tiny bells. Her own dress, a modest grey silk, was a testament to her station, present but not participating. Her mother had sighed before they left their cramped townhouse, pulling at the sleeves of Eleanor's gown. "Try to smile, dear," she had urged, her voice thin with a familiar anxiety. "One never knows who might be watching." But Eleanor knew. No one was watching. At 23, she was firmly on the shelf. A book no one had ever bothered to pull down, its cover unadorned, its story unread. She preferred it this way, she told herself. The shadows were safe. There was no rejection in the shadows, only a quiet, persistent loneliness that had become a familiar companion. From her alcove near the orchestra, she had an excellent view of the room's glittering spectacle. She watched Lord Ashworth and his coterie of sycophants. They were loud, flushed with wine, their amusement always at someone else's expense. They were the sort of men who thrived on the perceived smallness of others. Tonight, their target was the Duke of Allister. He stood alone near the French doors leading to the gardens, a figure carved from granite and shadow. He was a man of immense power and wealth, his title ancient, his demeanour impenetrable. Society called him the Iron Duke, a name earned through ruthless business dealings and a chilling emotional distance. He never smiled. He rarely spoke. His presence was an event in itself, casting a pall of seriousness over any gathering he chose to grace. Eleanor watched as Lord Ashworth, emboldened by drink and the appreciative snickers of his friends, approached the Duke. She could not hear their words, but she could read the scene as easily as a line of poetry. Lord Ashworth was gesturing, his expression one of theatrical challenge. The Duke's face remained a mask of cold indifference. Then, something shifted. Lord Ashworth's gaze swept the room, a predator seeking the weakest of the herd. His eyes passed over the vibrant, laughing debutantes, over the powerful dowagers, and then they settled on her. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, prickled Eleanor's skin. A finger of ice traced its way down her spine. Lord Ashworth's lips curled into a cruel smirk. He leaned in, whispered something to the Duke, and then pointed. He did not point discreetly. It was a clear, deliberate gesture, an arrow aimed directly at her heart. The group of men around him erupted in a wave of muffled, brutish laughter. It was a horrid, tearing sound that seemed to shred the delicate fabric of the evening. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Her hands, clasped in her lap, grew damp and cold. She wanted to shrink, to melt into the wallpaper and disappear entirely. Humiliation washed over her, hot and suffocating. They were laughing at her plainness, at her invisibility which had just been so violently stripped away. She saw the Duke's gaze follow Lord Ashworth's pointing finger. His eyes, the colour of a winter storm, met hers across the expanse of polished floor. The world seemed to contract until it contained only the two of them, the most powerful man in the room and the most insignificant woman. She expected him to turn away in disgust. She expected him to offer a curt refusal, a cold dismissal that would put Ashworth in his place and seal her own social oblivion. A fresh wave of laughter, even crueler than the first, would surely follow. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. But the Duke of Alistair did not turn away. He held her gaze for a long, silent moment. She could not read his expression. It was as blank and unyielding as ever. Then he gave a single, sharp nod. It was not a nod to Lord Ashworth. It was a nod to her, an acknowledgement. And then he started walking. He moved with a quiet, inexorable purpose, parting the sea of dancers as if by sheer force of will. The laughter from Ashworth Circle died abruptly, choked off as if by an unseen hand. A hush began to spread from that corner of the room, a ripple of stunned silence that followed in the Duke's wake. Every head turned, every conversation faltered. Eleanor's world narrowed to the sight of him approaching, the intricate patterns of the parquet floor, the glittering chandeliers, the faces of the curious onlookers. It all blurred into a meaningless watercolour wash. There was only the Duke, his dark coat a stark slash against the room's pale colours, his eyes fixed on her. He stopped before her alcove. He was taller than she had imagined, his presence overwhelming in its intensity. He blocked her view of the rest of the room, creating a small, private world around them. The silence was now absolute. The orchestra had faltered into quiet. He bowed, a gesture of perfect, formal grace that was utterly at odds with the crude joke that had summoned him. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, resonant baritone that sent a strange shiver through her. "Miss Vance," he said, and the simple act of him knowing her name was a shock in itself. "May I have the honour of this dance?" The words fell into the silence like stones into a frozen pond. It was not a request, it was a command, wrapped in the guise of courtesy. Eleanor could not find her voice. She could only stare at his offered hand, a large, gloved hand that promised either rescue or a more profound ruin. Her mind was a maelstrom of confusion and fear. This had to be part of the humiliation, a public spectacle designed for maximum cruelty. Yet, his eyes held no mockery. They were serious, intense, waiting. Slowly, as if moving through water, she placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, secure. He led her onto the dance floor, into the centre of the room, under the full weight of 100 pairs of staring eyes. As he settled a hand on her waist, the orchestra, recovering its senses, struck up a hesitant waltz. He guided her into the steps with an expert's ease. Eleanor felt clumsy, a wooden doll in the hands of a master puppeteer. She kept her eyes fixed on the knot of his cravat, unable to meet his gaze, her cheeks burning with a fire that consumed all thought. The grey silk of her dress suddenly felt like sackcloth against the fine wool of his coat. "Look at me, Miss Vance," he commanded softly. She forced her chin up. His eyes were even more unsettling up close, deep and shadowed, revealing nothing. "You are an accomplished dancer," he stated. It was not a compliment, it was an observation. "My father insisted," she managed to whisper, her voice sounding reedy and unfamiliar. "He said it was the one grace a lady could not afford to be without." "Your father was a wise man," the Duke replied, his expression unchanging. They moved in silence for a few moments, the only sound the swish of her skirts and the whisper of the music. The other dancers gave them a wide berth, creating an invisible circle around them. Eleanor could feel the stares like physical things, sharp and probing. She saw Lord Ashworth's face over the Duke's shoulder. His smirk was gone, replaced by an expression of slack-jawed disbelief. Lady Beatrice, the season's reigning beauty, and a woman who had long considered the Duke her personal property, was watching with eyes narrowed into furious slits. "Are you fond of flowers, Miss Vance?" the Duke asked, his voice cutting through her panicked thoughts. The question was so unexpected, so mundane, that it startled her. Yes, Your Grace, very. Which ones? He pressed, his gaze unwavering. I am fond of the less celebrated varieties, she found herself saying, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Wild roses, foxgloves, the ones that grow in the hedgerows. They have a resilience that hothouse blooms lack. For the first time, a flicker of something, interest, surprise, crossed his face. It was there and gone in an instant. An astute observation, he said. The waltz ended. The final note hung in the air, heavy with unspoken questions. He did not release her immediately. He held her there, in the centre of the floor, forcing the entire ballroom to continue its silent witness. Then he bowed again, a gesture of finality. Thank you for the dance, Miss Vance, he said. He then escorted her, not back to her lonely alcove, but to her mother, who looked as though she might faint from the shock. He gave a curt nod to them both and turned, walking away as purposefully as he had come, leaving a maelstrom of whispers in his wake. The rest of the evening was a blur for Eleanor. She was no longer invisible. She was a curiosity, a puzzle. People looked at her differently, their eyes filled with speculation. The mockery was gone, replaced by a confused, almost fearful respect. What had the Duke seen in her? What game was he playing? The next day, their small townhouse was thrown into chaos by the arrival of a footman in the Alistair livery. He delivered a heavy, leather-bound volume. It was a rare, hand-illustrated text, The Wild Flora of the British Isles. Tucked inside was a simple calling card bearing the Duke's crest. There was no message. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the cool leather of the book. Her heart was doing that frantic fluttering again. This was no longer a joke. A joke did not involve thoughtful, expensive gifts that spoke to a conversation whispered during a single waltz. This was something else entirely, something far more terrifying. Her mother wrung her hands, her face a mixture of hope and panic. Eleanor, what does this mean? The Duke of Alistair! It is unthinkable! I do not know, Mamma, Eleanor said, and it was the truth. She felt as though she had been plucked from her quiet life and set down in the middle of a play whose lines she did not know. 2 days later, the Duke himself called upon them. He sat in their modest parlour, a giant in a doll's house, his presence seeming to suck all the air from the room. He was polite, formal, and utterly unreadable. He spoke to her mother of the weather, and to Eleanor of the book he had sent. I trust you found it to your liking, Miss Vance, he said. It is magnificent, Your Grace, she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I have never seen such detailed illustrations. The artist had a particular appreciation for resilience, he said, his eyes meeting hers with a strange intensity. Before he left, he stood and addressed her mother, though his gaze remained on Eleanor. Madam, he began, his tone leaving no room for argument, with your permission, I would like to formally court your daughter. The teacup in her mother's hand rattled against its saucer. The request was preposterous. It defied all logic, all social convention. A duke of his standing did not court a dowerless spinster. He made advantageous alliances with the daughters of other powerful men. Yet he stood there, waiting for an answer, his expression one of grim determination. Her mother, flustered and overwhelmed, could only stammer her consent. The courtship, as it was called, was a strange and formal affair. He called on her twice a week. He took her for drives in the park in his immaculate carriage, the silence between them often stretching for minutes at a time. He never touched her, save for helping her into the carriage. He never offered compliments or flirtatious remarks, but he listened. He asked her about the books she read, the music she enjoyed, her thoughts on art. He seemed to dissect her opinions, turning them over in his mind as if they were matters of state. Eleanor found herself speaking more than she ever had in her life, sharing the quiet, internal world she had always kept hidden. He was a puzzle, a fortress of a man who showed no cracks, yet he had given her a key to a small, forgotten door. Society was in an uproar. The whispers followed Eleanor everywhere. Lady Beatrice made her displeasure known at a garden party a few weeks later. She cornered Eleanor near the rose bushes, her smile as sharp as thorns. "I must confess I am baffled," Lady Beatrice said, her voice dripping with venom. "I cannot imagine what the Duke sees in such a plain little mouse. Tell me, what sordid secret do you hold over him to compel this bizarre pantomime?" The insult landed like a physical blow, stealing Eleanor's breath. She had no answer, no witty retort. The familiar shame washed over her, cold and heavy. But before she could retreat, a low voice cut through the air behind her. "You forget yourself, Lady Beatrice." The Duke of Alistair stood there, his face a thundercloud. He had appeared from nowhere, a silent guardian. He moved to stand slightly in front of Eleanor, a subtle but unmistakable shield. "You are speaking to the future Duchess of Alistair," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a deadly chill that made the air grow cold. "I would advise you to choose your next words with extreme care." Lady Beatrice paled, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. She offered a sputtering apology and fled. Eleanor stood frozen, her heart pounding. The future Duchess of Alistair. He had said it. He had declared it publicly, turning rumour into fact, a shield into a promise. He turned to her, and for a fleeting moment, she saw something in his eyes. A raw, protective anger that was more expressive than anything she had ever seen from him before. "Are you harmed?" he asked, his voice softer now. "No, Your Grace," she whispered. "Only surprised." "You will grow accustomed to it," he said, and she did not know if he meant the insults or his protection. He offered her his arm, and they walked through the rest of the party together, a silent, united front that silenced all further comment. That night, Eleanor could not sleep. His words echoed in her mind. Future Duchess. It was a title, a life she could not comprehend. Why was he doing this? This grand, elaborate defence of her honour, this public claim. It was more than a whim, more than an eccentric game. It was a deliberate, calculated strategy. But for what end? She had to know the truth. The uncertainty was a torment, a constant hum of anxiety beneath the surface of their strange courtship. The next time he called, she requested a private word with him in the small library her father had loved. He agreed without question, his expression as impassive as ever. She closed the door behind them, the click of the latch sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. She turned to face him, her hands clasped tightly together to stop their shaking. "Your Grace," she began, her voice clearer than she expected. "I must ask you a question, and I beg you to answer me with honesty." He inclined his head. "I will." "Why?" The word was small, but it held the weight of all her confusion, all her fear. "Why are you doing this? Why me?" It began as a joke, a cruel dare at a ball. I saw it. I saw them laughing. He did not deny it. He simply stood there, watching her, his face a mask. "Is this some form of revenge against Lord Ashworth?" she pressed, her voice gaining strength. "Am I merely a pawn in a game between you and him? If so, I must ask you to stop. The humiliation of being your instrument is far greater than that of being the object of their scorn." He remained silent for a long moment, his gaze searching her face. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until Eleanor thought she might break beneath its weight. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, strained. "The dare was the opportunity," he said slowly, "not the cause." He moved to the window, staring out at the small, overgrown garden behind her house. He looked tired. For the first time, she saw past the Duke to the man, and he looked profoundly weary. "I have known who you are for a very long time, Miss Vance," he said, his back still to her. "For 10 years, in fact." Eleanor's brow furrowed in confusion. "I do not understand. We had never met before the ball." "We had not," he agreed, "but I knew you. You were a friend to my sister." The breath left Eleanor's body in a rush. His sister, Lady Annalise, a frail, quiet girl who had died of a lung affliction a decade ago. They had not been close friends, not really. Eleanor had simply been one of the few girls who hadn't minded Annalise's constant coughing, who was happy to sit and read to her in the garden when she was too weak to play. "Annalise?" she whispered, the name feeling foreign on her tongue after so many years. "She spoke of you," the Duke said, his voice tight with a grief that still sounded fresh. "She called you the kind one, the girl who shared her book of pressed flowers, the one who didn't run away when she had a coughing fit." He turned from the window, and his eyes were filled with a bleak, ancient pain. The iron mask had cracked. "I was away at school for much of her illness," he continued, his voice low and laced with self-recrimination. "When I returned, she was already fading. I would sit with her, and she would tell me about her days, about you. I saw you, once or twice, from a distance, a girl in a blue dress, sitting with her in the gardens, your heads bent together over a book." Eleanor remembered. She remembered a tall, grim-faced young man who would sometimes watch them from an upper window of the ducal mansion. He had seemed so severe, so unapproachable, a world away from their small, quiet friendship. "After she was gone," he said, the words costing him dearly, "I closed myself off. The world seemed a hollow place, full of grasping, shallow people. Duty was all I had left, but I never forgot. I would see you at social functions over the years. You were always on the periphery, quiet, overlooked. But I saw you." He took a step closer, his eyes pleading with her to understand. "I saw you endure the slights of society with a quiet dignity that was more noble than any title. I saw your strength, the resilience you spoke of in the wild roses. I admired it. I admired you. But I was a coward, trapped by my own grief, by the prison I had built for myself. I did not know how to approach you, how to bridge the chasm between our worlds." His confession hung in the air between them, stunning in its honesty. This man, this powerful, unyielding Duke, was admitting to a decade of silent observation, of cowardly admiration. "When Ashworth issued his disgusting dare," he went on, his voice hardening with contempt, "he thought he was offering me an insult, a plain, invisible girl to be my humiliation. He did not realise he was offering me the very thing I had wanted, but had been too frozen to reach for. It was a crude, contemptible opportunity, but it was an opportunity nonetheless. I took it." Eleanor stared at him, her mind reeling. Every strange, formal gesture of their courtship was suddenly cast in a new light. The book, his attentiveness, his swift, fierce protection. It was not a game. It was the clumsy, hesitant courtship of a man who had forgotten how to feel, who was trying to reach for something real across a decade of silent loneliness. He saw the pawn in a cruel jest. He saw her as the kind girl in the blue dress reading to his dying sister. "You are not a pawn, Miss Vance," he said, as if reading her thoughts. His voice was raw, with a vulnerability that stripped away the last vestiges of the Iron Duke. "You are the end point, the entire purpose of the exercise." He fell silent, having laid his soul bare before her. He stood there, exposed, waiting for her judgment. The powerful Duke of Alistair, awaiting the verdict of the invisible girl from the shadows. For a long moment, Eleanor could not speak. Her heart ached, not with fear or confusion, but with a profound, overwhelming empathy. She saw the lonely boy who had lost his sister, the man who had wrapped himself in armour so thick he could no longer find his way out. He had not been cold, he had been frozen in grief. She took a hesitant step forward, closing the distance between them. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and laid her fingers gently on the sleeve of his coat. It was a small, simple gesture, but it felt momentous. Through the fine wool, she could feel the tension in his arm. He looked down at her hand as if he had never been touched before. "Your Grace," she said, her voice soft but clear. "My name is Eleanor." His gaze lifted to meet hers, and in the depths of his storm-grey eyes, she saw the ice begin to thaw. A flicker of hope, fragile and new. "Eleanor," he repeated, the name a quiet prayer on his lips. In that moment, she made her choice. It was not a choice born of gratitude for rescue or desire for a title. It was a choice to meet the vulnerable man who had finally emerged from behind the ducal armour. She accepted him, not for the power he wielded, but for the decade of silent pain he had just confessed. "Yes," she said, answering the unasked question that hung between them, the proposal he had never truly made, but had been living for weeks. "Yes." A shudder went through him, a release of tension held for 10 long years. He raised his hand and gently, almost reverently, cupped her cheek. His thumb stroked her skin, a touch that was both a question and a promise. And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a passionate kiss, not a kiss of fire and demand. It was a kiss of profound relief, of homecoming. It was gentle, hesitant, and filled with all the words he had never been able to say. It tasted of loneliness and patience, of a grief finally shared and a hope finally realised. When he drew back, the mask of the Iron Duke was gone completely. In its place was simply a man, flawed and human, his eyes shining with an emotion she now recognised as a quiet, steadfast love. They were married 2 months later, in a small, private ceremony. Society was aghast at the lack of pomp, but neither of them cared for society's opinion. Their life together began not with a grand ball, but with a quiet journey to his primary estate, Alistair Manor, a place he had not truly lived in since his sister's death. It was a grand, sombre house, filled with ghosts and echoes. Dust sheets covered the furniture like shrouds, and the air was thick with the scent of disuse and sorrow. For the first few weeks he was quiet, reserved, the Duke of old threatening to resurface in the face of his past. Eleanor understood. She did not push. She did not demand. Instead, she began, quietly and patiently, to bring the house back to life. She started with the gardens. The beautiful rose garden where she had once sat with Annalise was now a tangled, thorny wilderness. With the help of the estate's elderly gardener, she began to reclaim it, one weed at a time. She spent her days with her hands in the dirt, coaxing life from the neglected soil. Her husband, it was still strange to think of him that way, would watch her from his study window, the same way he had watched her all those years ago. But now, when she looked up and smiled at him, he did not retreat. He would come down and join her, his large hands looking clumsy as he helped her prune the wild, resilient roses she so loved. Slowly, the light returned to Alistair Manor. Eleanor had the dust sheets removed, the windows thrown open to the fresh country air. She filled the silent rooms with flowers from her reclaimed garden. She found the old music room and began to play the pianoforte, its hesitant notes filling the halls that had known only silence for so long. He began to change. The transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. It was in the way he would seek her out at the end of the day, not for any particular reason, but just to be in the same room with her. It was in the small smiles that would touch his lips when he watched her arranging flowers or reading by the fire. It was in the way he began to talk about his sister, not with the raw pain of before, but with a gentle, wistful fondness, sharing memories he had kept locked away for a decade. One evening, a year into their marriage, he came to her as she sat in the garden, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of lavender and rose. He carried a small velvet box. "I have something for you," he said, his voice soft. He opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of satin, was a brooch. It was a delicate, exquisitely crafted wild rose, its petals fashioned from mother of pearl, its stem from silver, with a single, perfect dewdrop of a diamond on one leaf. "It belonged to my mother," he said. "She loved the gardens as you do. She always said that true beauty was not in the rare and cultivated, but in the things that had the strength to bloom wherever they were planted." Eleanor's throat grew tight with emotion. He was not just giving her a piece of jewellery, he was giving her a piece of his history, of his heart. He was telling her, in his own quiet way, that she belonged here, that she was the one who had the strength to make his barren world bloom again. He pinned the brooch to her dress, his fingers warm and sure against the fabric. "Thank you, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Thank you for showing me the way home." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full. The journey had been strange, born of a cruel joke and a decade of silent grief. But here, in this quiet garden, surrounded by the resilient flowers she loved, she had found her place. She was no longer invisible. She was seen. She was cherished. 2 years later, the sound of laughter echoed through the halls of Alistair Manor, a sound it had not heard in a generation. It was the laughter of their young son, a boy with his father's serious grey eyes and his mother's gentle smile. Eleanor watched from the doorway of the library as her husband, the man the world still knew as the Iron Duke, knelt on the floor, patiently helping their son build a tower of wooden blocks. He was smiling, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his entire face, erasing the last shadows of the lonely man he once was. He looked up and saw her there, and his smile deepened. He held out a hand to her, an invitation to join their small, perfect world. She walked toward him, her steps sure and light. They had once been two lonely souls, one hidden in the shadows of society, and the other in a fortress of grief. Now they were simply a family, their love a quiet, resilient bloom that had taken root in the most unlikely of soils. A person's worth was not measured by the world's acclaim, she knew, but by the quiet truth of a loving heart. It was a lesson she had learned not in a glittering ballroom, but in the steadfast gaze of a man who had seen her, truly seen her, all along.